evening, everyone. We've just hit 6 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started here. So hello tonight. My name is Zach Levinson, and I'm pleased to welcome you to what is the sixth offering of the 2020-2021 Global Issues Evenings and Distinguished Voices Lecture Series, which is hosted in partnership between the World Affairs Council of Jacksonville and the University of North Florida. Welcome to our World Affairs Council of Jacksonville members, our sponsors, our partners, and our high school Great Decisions participants, as well as our UNF students, professors, and their guests. As you know, we are looking forward to the days when we will once again be able to convene in traditional ways. However, this has been a most unusual year and a most unusual season, but we are still providing timely, informative, and engaging programs in new and innovative ways, engaging with our speakers digitally in the near term and welcoming them in person at the UNF Herbert University Center when it is possible to do so. This season, we are exploring a broad variety of topics focusing on current and relevant geopolitical and economic issues. To provide insights and context to these issues, we are being joined by some of the world's foremost experts, including Jon Huntsman, who's a former governor of Utah and ambassador of the United States to Russia, China, and Singapore, Amy Chua, the John M. Duff Jr. Professor of Law at Yale Law School, and Henry Kerr, who's the economics editor of The Economist. Tonight's Digital Global Issues Evening will feature former diplomat, author, and advisor on emerging markets, Anja Manuel. We will be fielding your questions at the conclusion of her talk, so please send in your questions via the Q&A box throughout her discussion, which you'll find along the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. There's also a chat feature, which you can use if you have any technical issues, and I'll be monitoring that throughout to help you and guide you through any issues that you face there. Of course, it's you, our members, sponsors, and partners that make these Global Issues Evenings possible. Thank you for your dedicated support, and a special thank you to our premier education partner, UNF, and our multi-year platinum sponsors, including Water Street Capital, Fleet Landing, and Coastal Construction Products with William and Barbara Harrell. If you are not yet a World Affairs Council member, I invite you to visit our website at worldaffairscounciljax.org and join this evening. Alternatively, you can email us or send us a message in the chat, and we'll be happy to get in touch with you that way and send more contact information. Now, I'll turn the program over to World Affairs Council of Jacksonville Program Committee Chairman, Jeff Bernardo.
Thank you, Zach. Greetings once again, and welcome to this Global Issues Evening presentation. Joining us is Anja Manuel. Anja is co-founder and partner along with former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates in Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel, a strategic consulting firm that helps US companies navigate international markets. She's the author of the critically acclaimed This Brave New World, India, China, and the United States. And from 2005 to 2007, she served as an official at the State Department responsible for South Asia policy. A graduate at Harvard Law School and Stanford University, Anja now also lectures and is a research affiliate at Stanford and is a frequent commentator on foreign policy and technology policy for TV and radio. Anja, we're so glad that you're able to join us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm so happy to be here. I wish it could be in person. It nearly was. So I hope everyone's out there getting their vaccination so we can all see each other in person in the future.
Yes, indeed. The sooner, the better. Anja, why don't we start with getting your 10,000-foot view on the current state of the relationship between the United States and India and China?
Sure. I'll start maybe with the US and China because it's on, it's in the headlines every day. And in a word, relations are not good. If there's one thing that people in Washington can agree on, it's that China has become more of a competitor to us than a partner. And that is as bipartisan as it gets in Washington. If you talk to Democrats and Republicans on the Hill, if you talk to the outgoing Trump administration, the incoming Biden administration, people are quite skeptical of China, especially of Xi Jinping, who of course has moved the country since he took over in 2012 into a far more authoritarian direction. So where does that leave us? I'll maybe start a little bit with what do we think Biden's going to do and how does that differ from the very tough on China line that the Trump administration took? I think you're going to see four important differences. One, the tone is already less strident, less combative. We're just calming it down. You saw that the president had a conversation with President Xi Jinping. It apparently went on for 2 hours. They had an honest sharing of views. There were no tweets, there was no name calling, but they didn't disagree on very much. So one, tone is very different. Two, there's going to be an even greater emphasis than there was under the Trump administration on human rights. Tony Blinken, our new Secretary of State, is famously related to a Holocaust survivor. He believes in human rights issues. So does President Biden. So I think you're going to see even more emphasis on what's happening with the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, and all of those issues that are really complex in the US-China relations. Third, I think there's going to be a genuine effort between the US and China to find some areas of cooperation, but they'll be limited. But here are a few. Global financial stability, very important, increasingly not possible without these two great powers at the table. Non-proliferation, China was actually quite helpful on North Korea sanctions in the beginning of the Trump administration. Hopefully we can get there again. Probably a little bit more cooperation on the pandemic. And finally, on climate change. There, I think it's dicey because, of course, the US has re-entered the Paris Climate Accord. And we say very loudly, the US and the Chinese, we want to cooperate on climate change issues, but that's going to very quickly become former Secretary Kerry pressing the Chinese to do more on the issue. So I'm not sure how long that will remain cooperative. And four, and importantly, I think as opposed to setting up a US versus China relationship, the way the Trump administration was willing to do, I think the United States now under President Biden is going to do a lot to push things through multilateral organizations. What's the joint US-Europe policy on China? What's NATO going to do about China? We're back in the WTO, we're back in the World Health Organization. So much more couching things in the world versus China's mercantilist policies, if that's the case.
Well, it sounds like there may be an inclination with the Biden administration to do sort of less unplugging, with the notion that you can disassociate yourself from China from a trade standpoint, sort of disconnect the ties from technology by prohibiting US companies from supplying certain things, to one where avenues of cooperation are sought and perhaps the potential for conflict or some escalation is lower going forward.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. You know, there's been a lot of talk in the press about decoupling and the idea that the US and Chinese economy is going to completely decouple and we won't trade with each other, like the US didn't trade with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, I think is completely fanciful. It just won't happen. The economies are too intertwined. And unlike the Soviet Union, which was self-isolating, it didn't really trade with anyone outside the Warsaw Pact. I think China is the largest trading partner of 90 countries around the world. They're a much bigger trade partner to many friends and allies of the US than the US is. So the idea that you can isolate China and its economy, I think is just not going to happen. However, I do think you specifically mentioned, Jeff, technology. And I think there you're going to continue to see selective decoupling. And I hope we frame it not in an adversarial sense that we're enemies when it comes to technologies, but that we say, well, look, there's a healthy competition on here. And we in the West, the US and Europe and others, think that we should remain the lead, especially on key things like semiconductors. Those are the chips that are in all your computers and phones and tablets. They run everything from artificial intelligence algorithms to our phone lines. So the West has to stay competitive in semiconductor chips. In artificial intelligence, we need to make sure that we are number one. In 5G and 6G, so this gets complicated, but all of the things that are going to run your telephones to the Internet of Things, the self-driving cars of the future, we need to make sure that there's a Western competitor there, not just Huawei and China. and then other aspects of biotechnology. I think in those areas, you're going to see more distance between, and I would say not just the US and China, but the West and China. So I don't think you'll see much difference there.
Anja, what you seem to be describing is a framework of cooperation, but one that has certain guardrails or lines that ideally are consistently enforced. Do you see an ability to enforce those guidelines? And that, I think if you look at the history, that's been a challenge, that multilateral organizations, when sort of at the point where something probably should be done, it's actually kind of hard to get something done.
Yeah. Yes, it's hard to enforce the guidelines. And let me take it in two pieces. So if you're talking about trade in general, there's one complaint that many American companies have, rightfully so, and European companies, which is it's not an even playing field. The Chinese are allowed to sell into our markets. We've opened our markets, but China really hasn't opened its market. And it's increasingly closing it further because there are Communist Party members now having to be on board of joint ventures with Western companies and so forth. All of those level the playing field issues. Is my intellectual property going to be protected if I'm doing business in China? Am I going to have to do the Communist Party's bidding? Is there going to be a social credit system for my employees? Those things are very, very complex. And I think you'll pretty soon see a trade negotiation around them. I would have tempered expectations. I would expect very little because ultimately the Chinese just have their system and they're going to continue to have their system. So that's one. And I think you can manage that, but you're right. International institutions, whether it's the WTO or elsewhere, are going to be able to do very little to enforce those guardrails. The second piece is what do you do on technology and this decoupling that you and I were talking about? And I think they're self-enforcing. If you say to Western companies, you cannot sell the most advanced equipment that makes semiconductor chips to China, they're going to not sell it, right? So it doesn't require international institutions. You can do it with the US local law, US national laws. You can do it with European national laws. And so you're not reliant on the WTO and others.
Well, thank you for that. Along the lines of sort of lines that cannot be crossed, and this also touches upon the importance of technology. Could you share your thoughts on Taiwan? People observe China's behavior as it relates to Hong Kong, certain promises made back at the handover from the British that are not being honored. And there's very little international pushback. Do you think that sets the stage for China to consider some potential assertiveness regarding Taiwan? And what do you think the international response will be or should be?
Thank you. Yeah, let me start with Hong Kong, because as many of our audience members probably know, Hong Kong was a part of Britain for 100 years until 1997. And in 1997, as a part of the treaty handing Hong Kong, this great international city, world financial center, handing it back to China, the agreement was made that for 50 years, there would be two different systems. Hong Kong would be a democracy with a free press, an open trading system, elections, and mainland China would be mainland China, more authoritarian, run by the Communist Party of China, et cetera. Well, increasingly, mainland China, Beijing, has been putting pressure on Hong Kong over the past few years. They've installed Carrie Lam. Only people were allowed to run in the local elections who were seen to be okay by Beijing. Pro-democracy activists were harassed. And so, of course, you've had all of these protests. You had 2 years of enormous protests, millions of people in Hong Kong in the streets saying, this is not the Hong Kong we want. We signed up for democracy and openness and freedom of speech. And in the midst of the pandemic last summer, Beijing took the chance and just cracked down. And they passed a law called the National Security Law. The pretext, I call it a pretext because I'm a Westerner, was to say, look, we need security. We can't have these protests. We need to make sure that Hong Kongers are safe. But what it actually means is all democratic liberties and human rights have been rolled back. This past month, nearly every remaining prominent pro-democracy politician was arrested, 53 of them. Many others have fled the country. And basically anything, it's a very broad law that says you're a criminal if you do anything that's subversion, terrorism, collusion with foreign forces, because there's always this worry in Beijing that Western intelligence sources are in there, you're going to be arrested. So basically, it's the end of freedom of speech, it's the end of freedom of the press, and it's the end of democracy in Hong Kong. It's a big deal, and it's incredibly tragic. The US, I think, responded appropriately. We very quickly did both. The Trump administration did an executive order. The Congress passed a law that sanctions just the senior Hong Kong and Beijing officials who were responsible for this. So the head of the police, Carrie Lam, who runs Hong Kong, and others, and says no Western financial institutions are allowed to do business with them. So we've pushed back hard, but it also shows how little the world can do. Short of going to war over Hong Kong, which we're not going to do, there's not really anything the West can do other than protest on the outside, and Beijing is not going to roll back their actions.
And so that leads us to another area which China considers part of their country, and Taiwan. You know, it's been said that, you know, chips are the new oil in what people need to be secure with from a geopolitical standpoint. And this ties into a question that we have from the audience. Randy asks regarding a potential military conflict. China has been investing substantially in naval capabilities. Just last week, they were conducting exercises just off the coast of some areas that are considered part of Taiwan. And so a lot of saber rattling going on right now. Do you see there to be potential for escalation that may end up being a military conflict? And what would you look for as signposts of that potential escalation?
Yeah, we're getting into the hard stuff very quickly. Chance of a military conflict between the US and China, I think and hope, is low. Chances of something more limited, like a skirmish or an accident where a few people die, I think are unfortunately extremely high. And here's why. So I'll take it in pieces. So mainland China, let me just back up. Almost all goods, including energy, everything that goes to China comes through its eastern seaboard, right? Because it's landlocked on its western side. 85% of China's oil and gas comes through this very narrow strait called the Malacca Strait, right next to Singapore. It would be very easy for the US and our allies to shut that down and make it much harder for commerce to get to China. The Chinese are understandably worried about this. And this is one impetus behind all the rail lines and things they're building under the Belt and Road Initiative. It's also one of the legitimate reasons that's making them more assertive in the South China Sea and elsewhere. Where I think the Chinese are overstepping, most people in the West would agree, is that they don't need to own the entire South China Sea, which is this enormous, if you look at it on the map, it's this enormous tongue-shaped area that juts out from mainland China that's thousands and thousands of kilometers squared, right? You don't need that. So the West, especially the US, has been pushing back and saying, we're going to continue to make sure that everyone can navigate freely through this area. And we've been consistently, the Obama administration stopped for a while, then the last 2 years they started again. It was really stepped up under the Trump administration. We sail Navy ships through there, back and forth, just to say, look, everyone can do this. This is not your sea, China. And it makes the Chinese very upset. But it's ultimately the right thing to do to show that the rest of the world can sail through there and international commerce can happen. The worry there is that there aren't a lot of procedures for the US and Chinese, or Japanese and Chinese, Australians and Chinese, to talk if there's a conflict. And the Chinese are militarizing some of their fishing vessels even, and saying, well, you just go in there and harass this American Navy ship. And you can imagine an accident happening and no one being able to de-escalate and just say, okay, these two ships rammed into each other, but we're done. We're not going to do anything about this. My business partner, Condi Rice, tells the story that when she was first national security advisor, one of their first crises was that the Chinese shot down an American intel plane in 2001. Now, that happens. It's scary when it happens, but it happens occasionally. I think they were hot, the Chinese were sort of hot dogging. The terrifying thing is that the US government couldn't get anyone in the Chinese chain of command on the phone for 3 days. They finally tracked down the Chinese foreign minister at some barbecue in Argentina. So that's the worry. The worry is that things that shouldn't get out of control get out of control. And that's what I would say about the military thing. You asked earlier about Taiwan. Should we move into that?
Sure.
Great. Taiwan is a more complicated issue because, of course, unlike Hong Kong, Taiwan, as many of you I'm sure know, split off from China at the end of the Civil War in the late 1940s. So mainland China became communist authoritarian. Taiwan eventually became a democracy. And the US has had a diplomatic fiction that we've maintained since the 1970s, and that has worked. We say there's only one China, because that's what Beijing says, but we're not really saying which one it is, right? So we don't have formal relations with Taiwan. We have lots of informal commercial relations. Mainland China, Beijing holds the National Security Council seat, the UN seats. Taiwan isn't really recognized by a lot of countries, but it's an economic powerhouse, it's a democracy. And increasingly, the Taiwanese are very worried about what's happening in the mainland. They trade a lot with the mainland, but they see what's happening in Hong Kong and they say, oh my God, are we next? Is Beijing gonna try to swallow us whole? And so Tsai Ing-wen, the current leader of Taiwan, won her election again last year by a landslide. She's very careful and very thoughtful. And I think the Biden administration so far has done this very well. They've said, we don't support Taiwan independence because that would be like a declaration of war for Beijing. But we're going to ensure that Taiwan has the resources that it needs to defend itself. It's a very careful line. And I worry that the Trump administration in its pronouncements was sometimes not so careful and diplomatic. And I think we're back to being very, very careful while being clear that we're supporting Taiwan. So I hope that that doesn't become a military flashpoint. Here's what's frightening about it. Mainland China is becoming increasingly aggressive there too, including since Biden was inaugurated, they've sent Chinese fighter jets into Taiwanese airspace a number of times, pretty aggressive. And when you ask the Chinese about this, they say, well, Taiwan is China. And so you worry maybe not about an outright military invasion of Taiwan, but you do worry that maybe mainland China does a blockade where commerce can't come in or out, where they slowly strangle the Taiwanese economy, where they shut down the underseas cables that gives them internet, where, if you really get a conflict where you mentioned chips, where they take over those factories, they're called foundries, like TSMC and others that are the most advanced chip manufacturing foundries in the world, right? So that is a scenario that I know my friends who are in government now are worried about and are thinking very carefully about, and everyone hopes doesn't come to fruition. That would be very dangerous, war between Taiwan and mainland China.
Well, let's certainly hope that it doesn't come to that. And perhaps there are other ways that incentivize China to sort of not be as aggressive. And this relates to questions from James and David. Could China sort of be somewhat governed by their own economic interest, where being too assertive in certain ways is simply bad for business. In that, say, for Hong Kong, it is still a financial hub for the region. If it wishes to remain so, there are certain things that need to be honored. And so, otherwise, financial firms globally can start to pull out. And then perhaps multilateral organizations like the WTO might have a hand in sort of encouraging China to sort of play by certain rules and be part of an enforcement mechanism. What do you think?
The question is China overreaching? Like, are they being too assertive economically?
Well, could there be an economic incentive set that helps China to not overplay their hand, in that overplaying their hand by being too assertive can be bad for business?
Yeah, that's right. No, it's a very thoughtful question. And I do think that is possible. I mean, that was the analysis behind letting China join the WTO in 2000 that Charlene Barshevsky and many other friends helped negotiate. The idea was the more you bring China into the world trading system, the more you incentivize it to play by the rules. And for years, every administration has said, well, as soon as China starts having their own really innovative companies, they're going to start wanting to protect intellectual property. That's slowly starting to happen. You'll see that in the phase 1 trade deal last year, there was a whole section on intellectual property, which is pretty strong and not something that we would have gotten through later. So I think you're right. You can incentivize the Chinese to do the right thing to a point. I don't think economic incentives will change the government in China to be less authoritarian. In fact, it's trending to more authoritarian, much more than it was a decade ago. And I do think the Chinese Communist Party has decided that very tight control over Chinese companies is in their interest. So where Alibaba, Tencent, all of these amazing, genuinely innovative companies basically had free reign. Just in the last year or two, you've seen them really reined in. You saw Alipay's IPO being derailed because Jack Ma said some very moderately critical things. You have seen increasingly Chinese Communist Party members being appointed to boards of private companies, not just state-owned enterprises. And so I think China just doesn't care as much anymore. They're much more concerned about the Communist Party of China staying in power, as they would say, for another 100 years, than they are about these small incentives that we could make on the economic side.
Anja, could we expand our conversation to include the other country that you've written extensively about, India? There's an old saying that demographics is destiny, and therein lies a key difference between India and China as it relates to forward economic growth. What's your outlook for India as it relates to its prosperity going forward, as well as the interconnectedness of India vis-a-vis China and the US?
Yeah, absolutely. Demographics is destiny. You're right. And that's important for India and China, because in China, within 10 years, by about 2030, fewer than half of Chinese will be in the workforce, fewer than 50%. So each working age Chinese is supporting their parents, grandparents, one child, now 2 children. And that means usually people save, they don't spend as much, and it means the economy doesn't grow as quickly. You're seeing that a little bit already. COVID threw everything into disarray, but the Chinese economy is slowly slowing down from, crazy growing 10% a year to now growing 6, 5 or so percent a year. India is the opposite. So India is in the middle of a youth bulge where if they can educate, educate all these young Indians and find jobs for them, that should be a huge lift for the Indian economy. And you're seeing some of that. You've seen Prime Minister Modi really push education, skilling, making it easier to start businesses in India with limited success, because the Prime Minister in India actually isn't that powerful. There's a lot that happens at the state and local level. But yes, you should see the economic growth rate in India go edge up and up and up, and the Chinese edge down a little bit because of this demographic dividend.
India is notorious for the amount of red tape that one needs to get through to run an enterprise, and not unique to India. It also applies to China. In a number of countries, there's sort of a corruption factor which is gaining greater attention. You could describe that as an economic inhibitor. Are you seeing progress there, where India may essentially break through to achieve at sort of a higher level of growth, such that we've got a bunch of tailwinds with demography and perhaps better governance factors, where India could be sort of to enjoy the growth that China had perhaps over the last 20 years?
Yeah, there is some progress. And this is a great story about how differently to understand China and India, because we tend to see these countries as monoliths and only see how they're interacting with the US. But of course, they're each struggling with their own internal issues. They're struggling with poverty, they're struggling with environmental issues, they're struggling with corruption. And India is slower, sometimes frustratingly so, but it's a democracy. So if things go badly, you can vote the bums out, right? And in China, since it's authoritarian regime, it's rigid, like a glass. You can tap it 100 times and nothing happens, but tap it just the right way and maybe the whole system shatters. So this comes really to the forefront when you see how each has fought corruption. In India, starting in 2011, 2012, people were so fed up with kind of the low-level corruption that a gentleman named Anna Hazare, he looks a little like Mahatma Gandhi, big glasses, elderly gentleman, just started a protest movement. He went on hunger strike. First thousands of people, and then tens of thousands, and then hundreds of thousands followed him. And they pushed through some really important reforms. It was from the bottom up, civil society, like something you would see here in the US. It's not perfect, but there's now an ombudsman. There is a system in India, which was being slowly developed anyway, that is a biometric ID system. So if you're owed a pension, for example, from the Indian government, you used to basically have to bribe the local guy to give you the pension that you were owed. Now you go to any corner shop, you have your irises scanned, your fingerprints done, and the money appears in your bank account. No bribes necessary. So there have been some improvements. That's not to say that it's perfect, but boy, it's getting better. China, top down, right? So when Xi Jinping came to power, he appointed one of his close allies, very, very smart guy, to run the anti-corruption campaign. When you ask that gentleman why they're doing this, he sort of stiffens visibly and says, we have to clean up the act of the Chinese Communist Party so we can rule for another 100 years. And boy, have they done that. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese officials have been arrested for graft and corruption. Several have lost their lives, right? Been prosecuted and then lost their lives. And so you do have a Chinese Communist Party that's much more careful about the corrupt activities that were seen as okay only a decade ago.
Now, how are you seeing the differences between India and China in their ability to form really durable relationships with other countries? We hear a lot about the One Belt, One Road initiative that is, financially making some countries obligated to China. China has ambition that perhaps the renminbi has a greater status in the international financial system. Where do you see that going, and where do you see India's role as a connected partner on the global stage evolving?
You're right. China has done a lot to expand its international influence. Historically, when, going back centuries, when China is strong and unified, it tends to find vassal states, not allies, people who pay tribute and are sort of beholden to mainland China. And that's a little bit how I would analyze the Belt and Road Initiative. It has a good reason, which is that China needs an outlet for all that extra capacity for its state-owned enterprises, right? Every airport and road and train station, if you've been to China recently, is already gleaming. And so you needed something to do with all that overcapacity, so why not build it anywhere else? You need a better way to get products to market and raw materials in. We talked about that with the Malacca Strait, so building the trains and rails and things. And by the way, it buys you hopefully a lot of goodwill and makes countries beholden to you if you're showering them with largesse. But Belt and Road has within it the seed of its own destruction, I would argue. And I think in the US, we're a couple of years behind in how we analyze it. We still think, oh my God, it's this big bad thing. More and more, when I travel to Africa, Latin America, where people used to only want to talk about China and how the Chinese were giving them, 0% interest loans, these countries are realizing that these loans are not no strings attached. First of all, the interest rates are going up. Secondly, there's collateral, right? If you default on your loan, then suddenly China owns your entire electrical grid or your port or whatever it is. And so people are starting to be a little more hesitant about it and say, well, maybe we don't want to take all this money from the Chinese. Now, that's small and uneven, but I think you see it. China does not, and you asked about alliances, China doesn't have any close alliances. They say that they have this great enduring friendship with the Russians. Dig beneath the surface, and it is more a marriage of convenience. There's a lot of, frankly, racism on both sides. The Russians don't much like the Chinese, and the Chinese don't much like the Russians. There's one, I think I can tell the story. I was a couple years ago in China and asked a big Chinese property developer, oh, are you doing a lot of work in Moscow? Because, this great new alliance between China and Russia. And he said, are you kidding me? Russia doesn't have any rule of law, right? So there is some hesitation there. India, of course, has close friends and allies, not formal allies, but has a close friend in the United States. It's getting increasingly closer because of our communal worry about China's overreach to Japan, Australia, and the US, this thing called the Quad. That's becoming very important, both in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So it's just very different approaches to how each of these countries manage their international affairs.
Thank you for that. We have a number of questions that ask about how dependent is the US on China economically, and how that might evolve over time. If you look at, say, a 5 to 10 year time frame, some people think that, well, perhaps we can reshore a lot of economic activity that had been transferred to China from a manufacturing standpoint, but a lot of that sort of simply can't. What's your prognostication on a medium-term basis?
Yeah. The US is dependent on China economically and vice versa. But it's not just the US, it's also Europe, it's also East Asia. It's a web of interconnectedness. And that's actually probably okay. It creates market distortions. All of our iPhones and things in our pockets are probably much cheaper than they should be, or that they would be if they were manufactured in the US or in Europe. So the interdependence means that our goods are substantially cheaper than they would be without the Chinese mega factories. But it creates real hardship in those communities that used to manufacture in the US. And we haven't been very good at finding retraining opportunities, new well-paying union job opportunities elsewhere. When you dig into this, it's really, I've read a couple of economic studies on this, and there's a big debate about how many American manufacturing jobs disappeared because of Chinese cheap labor, to use shorthand, versus just better machines and more efficiency in our own manufacturing processes. And it ranges from somewhere 65 to 85% are lost, manufacturing jobs are lost in the US because we are better at producing widgets with machines rather than humans, not because of China. So the idea that you're going to roll back the clock and be in the 1950s, I think is unlikely. But what we do have to do, and what I hear the Biden administration saying is, okay, we're going to try to do as much American manufacturing as we can. But in the meantime, we're going to find some support for the people who are legitimately suffering, find retraining, find a social safety net for them, and help them lead productive lives and have productive jobs that maybe are not in low-level manufacturing.
We have a question coming in from Kirsten regarding space. So all three countries, US, India, and China, are space capable. And there is some thinking that space will be a competitive frontier. How do you see that working out? Will there be more cooperation going forward, or will it be an area for potential conflict?
That's such a smart question. Thank you, Kirsten. I think it's going to be both. Hopefully you'll have these optimistic, beautiful areas of cooperation. I don't know, my kids are following the Mars rover nonstop. You know, you now have a Chinese mission to Mars. You have an Emirati, a UAE mission to Mars. That's impressive. And we should be cooperating as much as possible on things of that sort. It's also an area for conflict. And this gets really technical, but in particular, the US military is hugely dependent on satellites, GPS, really advanced communications systems that were built when basically the US was the only dominant power in space. And the Chinese know it. And so they're investing in their own satellites. They're investing in anti-satellite technology, so you can shoot down our military satellites and make sure the US military is blind, right? So that's a real race, and it's on. It's on in space, and it's on in cyber. Good question.
Well, we will see. It's technology and space. It is truly a new frontier for us that's ever expanding, and all three countries will be highly involved. We're nearing the conclusion of our time, and I'd like to bring a topic that I think we can sort of close on optimistic notes, and that's human rights. There's opportunities for improvement. There's some current crises there, for example, the Uyghurs in China, but also there's also potential for improvements regarding gender equality in both countries. And so I guess from the Uyghur perspective, and then also from the half the sky perspective, what do you see going forward regarding human rights in India and China, and how does that affect their growth, their stature in the world, and cooperation?
Yeah. The human rights story, especially in China right now, is very dark. I just was on the phone this morning with a former student who spent a lot of time in Xinjiang doing research, and it is the stories that are coming out of there. I don't know if you saw the BBC report, they're real. These are labor camps, concentration camps, not death camps, but they are labor camps, forced labor, torture, rape. It's not good, and it's getting worse. So that's going to continue to be a bone of contention between the US and China, and we should push back hard, frankly, because it's unacceptable. In India, it's a democracy, so they're more open. There are certain parts of the BJP, and every time I say something like this, I get nasty Twitter tweets from, from folks in India, but it needs to be said. India has been such a beacon in human rights, starting with the Mahatma Gandhi, from all through its history, right, as an independent nation. And there has been a little bit of backsliding. There have been attacks on Muslims. There's been a real shutdown in Jammu and Kashmir. You know, the internet was out for nearly a year. There are some pretty complex things happening on the right, in particular in India. That's not to say that we're blameless. You know, the US clearly has our own issues, race relations, human rights, you know, women's rights. We're struggling too. But amongst friends, we can say that there's room for improvement there too. On women's rights, which I do think that's an optimistic story, you know, China is doing impressively well. And frankly, you know, the US and India can learn a little bit from that. Mao fairly famously said, as you quoted it, women hold up half the sky. And under the Communist Party, women aren't so represented in politics in China, but they're very represented in business. When you talk to Chinese CEOs, a huge number of them are women, and it's just not seen as crazy the way it is in the US and in India. So that is an optimistic note to end on. Let me just say one more thing. I know we're out of time. The world seems scary right now. And when you just read the news headlines, it's, oh my gosh, are we going to war over Taiwan? And oh, what's happening with the Iran nuclear deal? And oh, what's happening here? The general trends don't need to be so negative. So we just talked about the three big superpowers, the US, India, and China. There is a path here for us to not get along on every issue, but to muddle through, manage our differences, not have a military conflict, and find a few solid areas of cooperation that we could build on. And I think there's also an opportunity for the US to lead in a positive and optimistic way. So I hope we are able to do that. Thank you.
Yes, that is our hope as well. Anja, thank you so much. We've learned a lot this evening in such a short period of time. It's been a real pleasure to host you on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Jacksonville. Zach, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Anja.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Anja, for what was a great talk and a very enlightening evening. We also look forward to gathering next month digitally with Ambassador John Huntsman. He'll be talking about the US and China, the new Cold War. You can find more information on our website or reach out to us via email or call our office, and we'll be happy to give you more information and get you all set up there. Thanks a bunch. Have a great evening.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you all.